thank you to Durga for that warm and thoughtful introduction, and so nice that I have been invited for this talk, seminar, lecture, whatever you want to call it. And I am very, very happy that I'm going to be talking to people at the other university, which I have one of the masters from this university where I'm talking to. That's in special needs education. I took that in 2016. So one of those three masters which I was referring to was from Linnan. So I've covered my bases. I've done one from Linnan, one from the Oslo Met, and the PhD is from Oslo Met. So yeah, it's good to be talking to all of you in social anthropology. Thank you, Durga, once again for this invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity. And my name is Gaga Chabra. I'm going to be talking about contours of ableism, and this talk will be a conversation on diversity, disability, and inclusion. And I've used the word conversation quite deliberately. Why? Because it's all right for me to come here, talk, make the point, make the arguments, and then leave. But what I really want, if I have the opportunity, and if you people agree and with this, that I would want you to participate. I would want you to ask questions, share your input, share your reflections, because you people come from very diverse backgrounds. Of course, you are academics, you are researchers, you are professors, you deal with students, you deal with other members of the staff at the university, you are PhD fellows, postdoc fellows. So the purpose is to kind of make this talk as dialogical as possible. As you might have figured out by now that I'm blind. So for me, auditory feedback is the most important thing. So if you agree to what I'm saying, then it's fine, it's great. If you disagree, then please share your input, say it out loud. What's the point which you find a little bit controversial, perhaps a little bit pushing the envelope, a little bit difficult to process. So please feel free to have a very low threshold when it comes to interacting right now, because that is something which would make this session very valuable. Having said that, as I mentioned, if by any chance whatever I'm speaking, it does not correspond to the slide, then have a low threshold and say, Gagan, what on earth are you speaking? This is not the right slide. Perhaps the slide did not move. Just do that, please. So that we are all on the same page. We have a dialogue about all these issues and topics, and perhaps potentially find some solutions. Because there's no point of talking about a problem day in and day out when you cannot be solution oriented and find something more tangible, actionable, and something which is measurable. Yeah. So now, I hope the slide has moved. Yes. Yeah, fantastic. So this is the lecture or the talk outline, broadly speaking. I'll first lay down the map and try to just briefly explain, give you a bird's eye view about what is the situation of persons with disability globally, what are the key facts linked to that in Norway. Then we'll talk a little bit about the definition of diversity and disability. What does that mean? What does that entail? I'll go a little bit forward about different discourses on disability, talk about different pyramid groups, and also talk about the overview of the barriers which often persons with disabilities encounter. And after that, we will take a deep dive into ableism, what it entails, key concepts linked to TABs, which Dr. Guy mentioned, temporarily able-bodied individuals, which is something which I would really want to, if I may, drill down into your consciousness, so that when you go back to your home and hit there and have a Christmas time and you look at the long span of life, you think, perhaps there's some credence to that temporarily able-bodiedness part. And also this concept of inspiration porn, a little bit provocative, but yes, we'll touch that. And I'll talk a little bit about where do you find ableism, how do you fight ableism, and conclude with some remarks at the end. So that's the overall plan. How does that sound? Sounds okay?
Sounds good.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So before I talk about persons with disabilities, the matter to you people in social anthropology and Premier University in Oslo. Quick question, does anybody know how many people with disabilities are there around the world? Approximately. Wild guess.
10% of the population.
10% of the population, that's really close. Fantastic. So the population is approximately 7 billion, so 700 million. Yeah, okay. Any other figure? Anybody can think of? Okay, let's check. Let's check. 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world. 16% of the world's population has some kind of disability. You might come and say to me, Gagan, I go to the Yuli market outside in Oslo and I don't find people on wheelchair or blind people. There are not that many people with disabilities. Well, how can 1 out of 6 person on this planet Earth have a disability? Vast majority of them live in the global south, developing countries, low, middle income countries, 800 million of them. And 470 to 480 million of these people are of working age. They are largely unemployed. Even in developed, rich, advanced, industrialized country like Norway, we don't find persons with disabilities fully employed. There is huge disparity. And if you want to know more about it and some of these controversial and hard hitting critical facts about Norwegian welfare state and what it has done for the welfare and labor market inclusion of persons with disabilities, I will refer you to my PhD that was applied. But coming back to this, 180 to 220 million young people with disabilities, children with disabilities are also approximately the same number. So the reason I'm saying all of this is that you people should know that this is a large group we are talking about in a global context, and you people get the chance to research on interesting, exciting topics, different cultures, different contexts, different countries when you travel down south or to other parts of the world. So perhaps it's worthwhile to keep this in the back of the mind that perhaps the societies which you are studying have large number of persons with disabilities who are invisibilized, who are not there in the visible consciousness of the society, who are not there in the popular culture. They are marginalized, they're excluded from the broader conversation. You'll say that's all fine and dandy, Gagan. What about, we live in Norway, why should we care about this? Let's check Norway. Norway, we are the best country in the world, yes. A moment of joy and pride. Number 1 on Human Development Index in 2019, number 2 in 2021. So it's fantastic when it comes to health, life expectancy, education, and gross national income. It's wonderful, wonderful, it's great. Norway spends 4.3% of its GDP on disability protection. What's the size of Norwegian economy, give or take? Any guesses? GDP, Norwegian GDP.
In excess of 5,000 billion kroner.
Yeah, so $400 billion, $500 billion, give or take, something like that. So if you take 4% of that, that is being spent on disability protection. So that's approximately $16 to $20 billion every year, which is a staggering amount. $16 billion means 160 billion kroner, give or take. A lot of money is being spent on disability protection, which entails providing social services, social benefits, sickness allowance, and so on. So again, you would expect that if Norway is spending that much, then the labor market outcomes or general social inclusion outcomes for persons with disabilities would be very good. And what I found in my research is that when it comes to having a decent standard of living, Norway is one of the best countries for persons with disabilities. It's very good. There's a lot of redistribution which takes place. So persons with disabilities have the chance and opportunity to get social benefits like uføretrygd, disability pensions, disability benefits, or social services like brukerstyrt personal assistance, one whom I have. So that's very good. But when it comes to the real inclusion, where persons with disabilities don't feel discriminated in the labor market, when the person with disabilities get a chance to lead a fulfilling, flourishing life. It's not the case. Norway has often been assessed as mediocre given how much we spend and what kind of return on investment we get on that spending when it comes to inclusion of persons with disabilities in the labor market as well as in society in general. And 17% of Norwegian population has some kind of disability. Again, this is, you might be wondering, that's a very big number. 1 out of 6 has some kind of a disability. And you would not assume that when you go out, that 1 out of 6 person you meet on the street, he or she has a disability. So you should be cognizant that there's something happening which we don't know when it comes to disability issues. There is a visible aspect of disability and there's an invisible aspect of disability. We'll touch that later. But this is the case for why you should be interested in this particular topic on disability. Now, okay, let's pivot towards diversity. You know, what is diversity in broad sense? You already might know these things, that you have to think about acceptance towards an individual, give respect towards an individual. These are the core elements of diversity. We have to move from this point wherein tolerance is the norm. In the past, the idea was that we will have tolerance towards people from religious minority backgrounds, from people from different ethnicities, people from different linguistic minority backgrounds, and so on. We have to move from that and say that, okay, every individual is unique in his or her own right. They have unique set of gifts, talents, curses, and problems. How do we maximize their gifts? And how do we leverage that towards a successful organization? So we move from just being caught up in this tolerance talk towards celebrating the human variation. These are different dimensions of diversity at a very crude level. There, if you think about the internal, external, and organizational, since I'm giving this talk with regards to the backdrop of that BA program, which Togai was referring to, I have involved this element of organizational as well. So it's quite intuitive. At an individual level, yes, I am blind. Yes, I have this racial element where, you know, like I'm not ethnic Caucasian or Norwegian. That's internal. At an external level, there is a element of geographical location. I have lived and raised in an Indian context. Then I moved to Norway, spent time here, been in the US, and other parts of the world, traveled, have had this educational background. That makes the element of diversity, which is external. And at an organizational level, right now I'm working as a project leader for inclusion, and my status in the organization, that matters. The affiliation with what kind of unions I'm part of, that matters. For you people, if you are on temporary contract as a PhD stipendiate, you are in a different situation as compared to those individuals who are in a tenured position, who are professors. So these all things matter when we are thinking about the question of diversity. The dimensions which one has to ponder about, think about a little bit. This is perhaps a little bit intuitive, exploratory. So I'll move to disability as part of human diversity, because that's what is one of the most important things. So if you look at this, there's a definition of disability which I have involved, which is the most progressive, the most human rights oriented definition, which talks about, okay, what is disability? It is an evolving concept. It arises out of an interaction of persons with impairment on one side, and accessibility and attitudinal and environmental barriers on the other side. So there are 3 elements. First is the fact that it's evolving concept. Would anybody want to reflect on that? What does that mean? Why does this human rights oriented definition of disability says it's an evolving concept? You all are anthropologists, studying different cultures, different contexts, different countries. Why evolving? Why not fixed? Why not static? Why not something which is determined?
Because the social and technological environment evolves and requires more and more from people, and so people with disabilities might be confronted with demands from their environment, say, I don't know, touchscreen technology or whatever.
Yes, fantastic, excellent. So it's something on those lines. Let's break it down with a simple example. 200 years ago, this country, beautiful country wherein we find ourselves, was predominantly being filled with farmlands, fisheries, and so on. At that time, you are on a farm, you have 3 siblings, none of the siblings read or write, because people did not read or write 200 years ago. So the problem of dyslexia did not exist. The issue of dyslexia is an issue which arises predominantly because we live in this knowledge economy where information is bombarded to us from all corners, and we have to process that information and come to some decisions, conclusions. So, absolutely right. Social aspect, the technological aspect has a huge influence on how disability is understood and defined. So, and the other aspect which I would like to also underscore, which is there in the definition, which talks about that it's an interaction which is taking place when a person with impairment is on one side and attitudinal and environmental barriers are on the other side. I would like you to just keep that in the back of your mind, because we'll address that in the upcoming slides. And of course, as you might see, that there's wide variety when it comes to persons with disabilities. There's an extreme amount of diversity and variation. You are seeing me, who is blind, who is born in India here, but you might also know of individuals who are on wheelchairs, who are women, who are from different sexual orientation backgrounds, and on minority backgrounds. So there's tremendous diversity within the disability group. And also the most important thing is that there is this element of visible as well as invisible disability groups, which is very, very crucial. And largely speaking, when we think about diversity issues or inclusion issues, we don't think about disability. It's a topic which is rather been on the fringes of this broad discourse. So when we think about diversity, we generally think about gender diversity, and we say, great, 50-50, wonderful. When we think about inclusion, we think about racial inclusion, great, and we stop there. So one of the purpose also to come here and talk to all of you is to kind of just broaden the horizon a bit, make some more space for this conversation to take place when you people reflect on when you are talking to your students, or when you're talking to your fellow colleagues or other individuals in the university system. You think about diversity in a bigger tent, where you say, okay, yes, gender important, yes, racial and ethnicity, minority status important, but also perhaps shouldn't we think about disability? Visible, disability is of course quite intuitive, self-explanatory. Person on the wheelchair, you'll see, and then you say, I can see the person is disabled. Problem. Invisible, that's the tricky one. That's where, when these numbers come up, 17% of Norwegian population says that they have some kind of a disability. We are talking about individuals who have, for instance, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, muscular issues, mental health conditions. And now you might be thinking or reflecting already, where am I going with this? Because if you think about this, disability as a label, or disabled person as a label, is quite stigmatizing. So even if an individual who is chronically depressed is confronted with the thought that, okay, perhaps you are disabled, my friend, they might say, no, I'm not, I'm just depressed. Or it's very, very important to kind of take these dimensions into account, especially when it comes to talking about students, bachelor students. We're talking about retention. We are talking about a lot of quote unquote Gen Zs and millennials. They are having a lot of issues with mental health conditions. There's a lot of research about that. People have talked about fragility and anti-fragility. There's a famous book called The Calling of the American Mind, which I could refer to. So the point is this, that when you think about disability in your head, the first image perhaps might be of a person who's on a wheelchair, or might be of a blind person, but I would invite you to move beyond that and think about individuals who have mental health conditions. ADHD. If you find students who say that we find it difficult to follow the classes because we cannot focus. So how, or we cannot sit in and take the 6-hour exam, it's too much, or 3-hour exam, it's too much. If that is the case, then how does the administration at the university accommodate their need so that they don't drop out? Yes, so all good thus far. Visible, disability, invisible, and then, okay, now let's go to the different discourses of disability. This is something which is quite, might be of quite interest for all of you anthropology department. Like there's this, if you travel across different cultures and even in the same cultural context, you might find these different preferences. So for instance, there is first of all, philanthropic understanding of disability, which assumes that the moment you have a person with disability, human tragedy is involved. You know, like life is ruined, over. It's better to be dead than disabled. That kind of thought process. Then there's biomedical understanding where an individual is like, okay, the good old Coldplay song, Fix You comes in, you know, find an individual with impairment, and we want to fix that person through surgery, through some kind of medical intervention, through some treatment. And there's also the sociological understanding of disability, when there's some demands made by the society, which was also referred by one of the participants, and you become disabled as you cannot fulfill those demands. There's economic understanding of disability, which talks about the off balance between how much you need and what productivity you have to contribute to the society. And then finally, there's the social political understanding of disability, which talks about that it's a process wherein disability is created largely because of the barriers which are there in the society, and you need social political mobilization to ensure that these barriers are removed and human rights and human flourishing for persons with disabilities is cherished, accepted. So, depending on how you conceptualize disability, or what's the framework in which you will see individuals with disability, you will find yourself either rooting for charity, pity, sympathy, or surgery, or human rights orientation. It's very, very important that, you know, when you're thinking about your students or people around you, when you're looking around and you find, oh my God, this person has some issue, I don't know what it is, perhaps it's autism, perhaps it's Asperger's, perhaps something, do you think that that person should get fixed? Or do you think that, yeah, he or she has that issue, and perhaps, who knows, life is long, I might have a bout of depression and anxiety in the future, if there's a tragedy which hits me. So I will be empathizing with that person's state of being and meet him or her where he or she finds himself or herself. So that's something which I would like you to reflect upon. Yeah. Now, about the barriers, these are the broad buckets of barriers. Largely speaking, physical barriers, of course, quite self-explanatory, like there are these steps, and if you use a wheelchair, wants to enter, it's difficult. Social barriers, that's where, you know, prejudices, discrimination, attitudinal barriers, ableism, all that gets lumped in. Institutional barriers is the things wherein we were, Thorgarden was referring to, that sometimes it's the question of the means at hand and intentions. So you might have the best of the intentions that yes, we want to have universal designed classrooms, or you want to have accessible classrooms where all individuals, irrespective of their ability status, can participate. But we don't have the right means, so there's no policy, there's no budgets when it comes to, or no strategies for including persons with disabilities. And last but not least, there are communication barriers, like different individuals communicate differently, deaf individuals require sign language interpretation and captioning services. So if that's not there, if the deaf student wants to take a social anthropology class, this deaf researcher wants to work on the deaf culture, deaf cultural anthropology with you people, and how does that materialize? How do we make it work? Now, so out of all those barriers, I will zoom into this one specific barrier, which is ableism. As you can see, of course, one of the other isms in the town: racism, sexism, ableism. But this one is quite crucial, as I will explain, that it's a little bit difficult, or perhaps impossible, to switch your races. You know. So when it comes to ability status, you right now might find yourself in this sweet spot of high productivity, independence, and being active, involved, engaged. But it might not last. We don't know what future holds for us, and at the end of the day, we're all aging. So it's important to kind of take ableism a little bit more seriously than what we would take. So what does ableism mean? It's prejudice and discrimination against an individual simply based on the fact that the individual is classified as disabled, as having an impairment. So if this disability is physical, mental, visible, invisible, doesn't matter. You're classified as that. I have prejudice, and I will discriminate against you based on that. There's a video which I would like you to see or listen to. Let's see if it works.
What is ableism? It is a form of discrimination based on a value system that considers certain body and mind characteristics essential to living a fulfilling life, and assumes that the quality of life of people with disabilities must be very low. In ableism, like in racism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression, dominant social groups project their own image as the model for how humanity should be, rejecting or ignoring others as inferior, not normal, or unfit. This bias is used to justify their exclusion, sometimes even their extermination. One example is the eugenics movement, which emerged in the early 20th century and resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 women, men, and children with disabilities under the pretext of improving humanity's gene pool. In Nazi Germany, more than 300,000 persons with disabilities were exterminated because their lives were considered unworthy. But despite the scale of these atrocities, ableism continues to spread, and its significance remains little understood. Ableist social views still shape our understanding of what it means to live with disabilities and how the lives of people with disabilities are valued. Thousands of women and girls continue to be sterilized against their will, and many more persons with disabilities spend their lives confined in institutions, prisons, or at home, and deemed to be incapable of living in the community. Ableism underpins the way our societies are organized. Basic daily activities, such as going to school or work, taking public transport, doing groceries, or practicing a hobby are made difficult, if not impossible, for persons with disabilities and end up excluded and isolated. Human rights challenge ableism and other forms of oppression and fight for a world where diversity is valued and embraced. Humanity is always changing. People everywhere use their minds and bodies in different ways, and those differences are what makes us stronger. Human diversity is all around us. We are all part of it. Let's embrace it.
Let's see. Any reflections on this video? What's a key takeaway which you got from this video? Anybody?
I have a reflection to share, not in relation, it's in relation to ableism, but it's in relation to our department. And it's that in relation to having the best intentions. And the department have been remodeled, and in the toilet you have the sign, it's a handicap, and then you have the bride or the code on the door of the toilet, but anymore. So if you go from the elevator, so you need help to find that door in the first place. And also the language handicap. And it's not disabled, it's like and I think it was the best intention, but it was also a lot of ignorance in relation to this
Yeah.
topic.
That's a very good point, actually. Yeah. No, absolutely. The language is such a crucial part when it comes to these kind of discussions, because language can be quite oppressing and excluding. And I have written about that as well, that it's important to kind of move away from ableist language, just be a little bit more sensitive towards the, don't use the word handicap, for instance, or in the past people have used the word retarded, for instance. These are words which should be thrown into the dustbin now of history, and we should move forward with a lot more inclusive terminologies. And but of course, ignorance is the main part of this, and that's why perhaps this talk is important a little bit. One quick thing, I'll see if it can. No, I cannot. Does it move forward now? So without froze. Sorry. Froze a bit.
Yeah.
So this one is. Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Good.
Now it's working.
Fantastic. Okay, but think about this, that you all might have heard about the 6 million Jews, which was an awful, inhumane thing which happened to the Jewish diaspora by Nazis, right? But very few people know about the 300,000 persons with disabilities were also executed, just because of the fact that the rationale was, let us make a perfect gene pool. Why do we need persons with disabilities, persons who are autistic, persons who have other conditions? Like, why do we need these individuals? We don't need these individuals because the idea is that we want to be as utilitarian as possible. So sometimes, when there are these arguments which are being raised about, oh, we don't have this much money or this much, or we have to kind of balance things, then it's very important to kind of explain historically how this group has been so excluded, and to the point that it has suffered from extermination, just because of the fact that the able-bodied society or individuals who are there, they decide that, what's the need? Let Iceland be the first country which is Down syndrome free. This news broke a couple of years ago, and that offended many parents who have children with Down syndrome. Then what are you talking here?
Yeah.
So we have to be a little bit more sensitive to these topics, or these issues. Yeah, and okay, so there's objectification of persons with disabilities. Broadly speaking, two big categories: tragic victim and inspiring hero. We all intuitively get it. Oh, Gagan, you're blind. You must be having such an horrible, awful life. How do you manage in your life? How do you get out of the bed? And I'm so happy that you're here. That kind of thinking. Or like, gosh, Gagan, how do you remember all of this stuff? And inspiring. So either you're looked down upon or you're looked up to, and then you're like, I'm like, for the sake of goodness, please just treat me as a fellow human being. I'm like you. Give me the same human dignity. Don't try to sugarcoat things or don't try to downgrade things. So that's very, very important, that kind of objectification. Inspiration porn. If you happen to have some time, this is 10 minutes very well spent. This is from Stella Young. She passed away. She was very young, from Australia. She talks beautifully about and very powerfully about this concept and how the non-disabled Australian society just decided that she should be given a community award for the simple fact that she was alive in the community. She was living in this community, and she was just alive, and they said that we have to celebrate Stella, the fact that she's alive. So she says that, thank you so very much for making me your inspiration porn of the day. So please, I don't want that. I don't want you to kind of make me, objectify me in this very crude fashion. And and if you want to know more about ableism in the Norwegian context and so on, there's another TEDx which I have given. That's another plug for the sidebar. Yeah. Now, these are the three things which which are quite crucial when it comes to the ABC of ableism. Why on earth do we think in this prejudicial way? There's an affect element say, response of pity, fear, and all that stuff which comes in our hearts when we see a person with disability. And there's also the behavioral aspect, wherein what do we do with that affect, the pity, the fear which comes into our heart? We kind of say, oh, I want to avoid the person with disability, I don't want to bump into him or her, for instance, and so on, instead of engaging. And then there's a cognition element, which talks about stereotyping, because life is short and we want to just jump into the most intellectually lazy or easy stereotypes as possible. Disabled people, let's put them into this basket, fill it up with whatever ideas we have about them, and we keep it consistent over the years. And we don't kind of qualify that or check that with the person whom we are interacting in flesh and blood. So stereotyping happens. There's three things which are quite interlinked and quite important. A triad. The first is this triad of dichotomies: simplistic understanding of the world as healthy, unhealthy, disabled, non-disabled, productive, unproductive, species typical, and species deviant. Disabled people are those who are species deviant. This is a quote unquote a freak accident taking place in Mother Nature's plan, and disabled people find themselves to be alive. So those kind of dichotomies are there. There's also this question of normalcy. There's a tyranny of normalcy, which I talk about, that we want to think about, okay, let's make a classroom. Let's talk about the average student, the normal student, And when we do that, we often dilute the significance of diversity, differences, and things which make the uniqueness of the individual important. So it's important to kind of reflect on these things and not think on that this is a normal employee, this is a normal colleague, an average independent colleague, or this colleague requires someone to walk with him to this spot, so how different or weird or strange that is, or this colleague uses a wheelchair. What's the difference between walking and wheeling when we are moving from point A to point B? Who cares? In a way. So thinking on those lines perhaps. And temporary able-bodiedness, very, very crucial, because as I mentioned, we all are going to grow old. We all, our faculties, emotional, psychological, physical, might decline. There might be bad breaks which we might get in our lives because of psychological trauma. There might be some physical injuries which might take place in our lives. We don't know if you are having children, what kind of physical, emotional state our children might find ourselves. So disability as a theme is a lot more closer to us than what we expect or what we accept. We have to think on those lines. That you go in Poskef area, down to Thrissur, you are having this amazing ski holidays, and you are going downhill, and suddenly you fall down, and boom, next thing you know, you have a spinal cord injury. And you are this professor who has been doing so well, publishing, having a great life, everything sorted out. So then, suddenly, those pesky steps will hurt you. It'll come to your consciousness. So that's why I'm just saying that think on the fact that this is temporal aspect of ability. Quickly about where do you find ableism? You find it at the institutional level, at the personal level, and an internalized level. Institutional, obviously, certain institutions you cannot. It's not easy. For instance, if you cannot stand up and work, then you're not allowed to be. You're not apply for a job, for instance. That institutional. That was if you want to be a banker, you have to stand up for 5 hours. Hypothetically, that's a policy. Interpersonal level, we like to be in this cozy, comfortable space of presumptions and assumptions and stereotyping, because we want to just do the bare minimal and we are interacting with an individual. So that's where ableism arises. And internalized is something which is a little bit more subtle, that this is for persons with disabilities if they have lived under this whole societal norms wherein people have told them day in and day out that we have lower expectations from you, we have negative attitude towards disability, the portrayal of disability on persons with disabilities in media, culture is derogatory, or they hearken on this idea of tragic victim, on separation porn, then they kind of internalize it. They think, no, perhaps I'm not good enough, I'm not supposed to get this, I'm not supposed to be working, why should I be working? Perhaps getting an overthink is not that bad of an option. How do you fight it? Again, you fight it on the three levels, intuitively speaking, institutional level, you come up with accessibility policies, universal design policies, you put your money where the mouth is, you make sure that these are not just good, noble intentions, fantastic, enlightened rhetoric, but it's something which is very, very important to follow it up with money and resources. Interpersonal level, don't judge the book by its cover, try to make an effort. We all have prejudices, we all swim in the sea of ignorance, there's no problem about that, to accept it and say that, okay, I'm meeting this one individual, let me see what he or she, what are the perspective which he or she holds, and let me make an assessment subsequently. At an internalized level, just reminding ourselves that we are all temporarily able-bodied individuals and we are tabbies. So a few concluding remarks as to say that, okay, first there's the intersection between diversity and disability. It's very, very intuitive, very clear. If you reflect on it for 1 minute, you will understand it. But the sad part is that disability is often left out from the broader diversity discourse, the broader diversity conversation. So think on that when you're interacting with the students, fellow staff members and so on. Think also on the fact of that ableism does exist in Norway. If you want to read more about it, ableism and blindgata in Norway. That's based on my chronic, based on my research from 2020, or ableism i landet i Elsker. Again, another chronic based on this thing. So what I'm trying to say is that if we can, let's try to rid ourselves from the tyranny of normalcy and dichotomies, and kind of accept that we are all temporarily able-bodied individuals. And finally, having policies which are inclusive, universal design, which I mentioned, that's a way, being more curious and respectful towards persons with disabilities in interactions, that's a way to combat ableism. One last thing, this is something which is quite important. 3rd December was Persons with Disabilities Day, United Nations Persons with Disabilities Day. And this came to my attention, which I thought of sharing with all of you, which is quite interesting, that we talk about accessibility and we think, okay, accessibility is broadly speaking, you are able to get into the door, get into the building. You have the access. Okay. Diversity is that you get a chance, okay, we have this diversity, we have a diverse group of individuals, you sit on the table, you can sit on the table. Inclusion is when you get a chance to kind of speak something when you're sitting on the table, because often the resources are not, power is not distributed equally when you're sitting on the table. So inclusion is something where you have a voice, and belonging is the point where your voice is getting heard. When you're making the point, it's being registered, and some action is being taken place. So I would invite you, encourage you to reflect on this topic of ableism, diversity, disability, inclusion, and see in your work how you can make your nearby environment, just in the microcosm, as inclusive as possible for all individuals, irrespective of their ability status. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gagan. We have a plan with this, not just the one I tried to sketch out earlier today, but also a plan for this for the coming 45 minutes. We start out with just getting 2 or 3 together and talking through some of the points that we're left with from Gagan's talk. See how we can operationalize them, apply them in our own, the respective lines of work, cooperation with colleagues, interacting with students, and also maybe have a keen eye out, as Cecilia's just demonstrated, on those small things that can make a huge difference. Because the sum of all these small things means that people eventually are told the larger image is you don't really belong here, or this place is made for other people. And so I suggest that we do this for 10 minutes, 2 or 3 together, along the lines that we're.
Can I ask a question to Gaga in relation to the lecture?
Yeah,
Yes, because then I thought we'd return to the lecture, but if it's directly related to lectures,
Yeah, I think related to the lecture,
Yeah.
it's in relation that I pay attention that you listed race as an internal dimension of diversity.
Yes.
And the way I understand race for me is a relation of a power relation.
Yes.
So I was wondering why race was listed as.
Yeah, I wanted to provide it as simplistic definition as possible. Of course, I agree with you. That is this element of a relational angle to the race question. And the same holds true for disability. If you think about it, like I gave the definition, I said that it's a relation or an interaction between the person with impairment on one side and the attitudinal and environmental barrier on the other side. So there's the relation aspect also with disability. But what I wanted to explain in a very simplistic way is that there's some things which are much closer to us and some things which kind of go a little farther to us. So even if that relational aspect of race is entering in, which is true, it does, but it's still, for instance, if you are born, like if the fact that I was born in India, I cannot tomorrow start saying that I identify myself as a Nordic, Caucasian, blue-eyed individual. That's the point which I'm raising. I cannot move from, because it's a lot more closer to me. Whether I like it or not, it has been done in a way. But of course, like how I move in the Norwegian society, like how I'm perceived by the people around me, some people think that I'm from Latin America, people have approached me and start saying, hola, hola. I'm like, okay, that face of like, where are we going with this? Do you understand what I'm saying? So of course those elements happen, but so there's that relational aspect. But whether I like it or not, there's something which are almost given to me historically and by providence. So yeah.
Can I also make a short comment? Just to add to what Cecilia said, because this is very much about framing. Well, thanks very much for a great talk, by the way. It's extremely relevant for us, both as human beings and as social anthropologists. But it's a question of framing. What are the criteria of exclusion? Why are some forms of exclusion visible and therefore addressed, and others somehow go under the radar but are no less effective? So in this country we may be doing reasonably well when it comes to gender and possibly sexual minorities. And then there are other forms of exclusion which are being addressed but not dealt with. And the third form of exclusion which are neither being addressed nor dealt with. And the third one is largely what you are talking about in many respects. So it's most welcome, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about later on. Thank you.
No, absolutely, that's a fantastic point, and this is what I wanted to stress, because often in the Norwegian context, when we say diversity or wonderful, we are mostly it's like almost a conditioning which has happened that we think of gender diversity and we often stop the thinking process at that point, or inclusion, we think of racial inclusion or minority inclusion, we stop at that discussion. So we have to kind of broaden the horizon a little bit, have a bigger tent and say that when we think about diversity, inclusion issues, can we bring, for instance, other dimensions as well, perhaps disability, perhaps linguistic minority status and so on. So it's very, very crucial. And also the other important thing which has to be mentioned is that at the end of the day, it comes down to how much quote-unquote power is there vested in the group, for instance. Like in the Norwegian context, it has had a very glorious and amazing history of women's rights movements, and they have argued for rights, and they have fought hard, and they've succeeded, and it's a fantastic story. But when it comes to persons with disabilities, often they are the ones who don't have the power, the political power or power for bringing social change, and they are seen as individuals with a little less less consequential when it comes to, for instance, broader movements in society. For instance, if there is an election taking place, people don't court and say like, let's go to have something for persons with disabilities. They don't generally do that. They think of other groups like farmers and fishermen and oil people and business people, and if you know what I mean. So what happens is that there is exclusion and marginalization which happens at multiple levels. So and culturally as well, what stories we tell each other on disability also matters so much. So it's not in the consciousness of individuals. People just, and then it's not in the consciousness, as they say, this good out of sight, out of mind. So
Yes.
Yes, the dam is broken, so we'll just open up the floor now.
Thanks very, very much for a great talk. I have a question on the data. Perhaps you can illuminate us at one point, and I leave aside for a moment the contested definitions, because they're, historically, culturally, politically, economically, and so forth, contingent. But at one point you mentioned, I was intrigued, and please correct me, that perhaps about 43% only of, in quotation mark, disabled people enter the Norwegian labor market.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, now for us, in the higher education sector, do we have figures of how many people, because there again, compared to the so-called able population, the rate is lower. Do we have figures of how many enter the higher education sector? Not in terms of employment, but as students. How many go into higher education? Because that would be very interesting for us to know. Do we have figures about that?
Yes, there are figures about that as well, and you're right that this 43% figure has been quite stable for the past 2 decades, since 2001. That has been the figure. And that's where, for us, the critique comes, that why on earth, then if we spend so much, why can't we get these people into employment? And one of the questions is that often young people with disabilities are told that what's the point to go and take education, and when you might not even get into employment. That has been a very sad trajectory. There have been reports which have said that 6 or 7 out of 10 people who are using wheelchairs, they find it difficult to transition from Vidregården or high school to go to university, for instance. And that I have critiqued that. I mentioned that in some of my chronic as well, or opinion pieces, that what Norwegian government has tacitly done is that since it's having such a fantastic, comprehensive welfare state with such good social protection, that it has kind of given some individuals leeway to say, perhaps you don't have to go to education and take up employment because it's going to be difficult. The easy way out is to just take the benefits, for instance. So there are numbers like that which exist as well. Although I must say that many of the persons with disabilities find themselves to take education as a very good option, even though they don't get into employment. So for instance, they would take a bachelor's year or a master's year and so on, and then transition to, for instance, disability benefits. For instance, instead of going into employment, because employment pathway is quite treacherous and tricky for them. And this number also includes the part-time, like if you work 1 hour a week, you're considered as employed. So there's a lot of, shenanigans which take place at SSB as well, or like with the current accounting. So yeah, it is what it is. But it's a good question, but I don't have the most contemporary data with regards to how many persons with disabilities end up at schooling, but or at higher education institutions. But it's tougher, I know, for individuals, young individuals in wheelchair, to move from the regular to higher education.
Thank you. I also ask something about intersectionality. Could you talk a bit more about that, and how differently able people or different abilities intersect with the broader position in society, and especially with class?
Yes.
Because clearly, I mean, disability is a class experience, isn't it? I mean, and a lot of it comes down to infrastructure, which is again the second question I want to ask. And because obviously, I mean, you know, I mean, if I am to speak from the experience I have from Athens, where I mean, there's 4 million people in a congested city. That literally the infrastructures of the city seem to be almost conducive to exterminating the disabled population. Really, I mean, it's impossible to cross the street, even if you're on crouches. So yeah, if we could just like reflect a bit on these structural levels, infrastructure and class, that unfortunately, as much as we try, with the best if we come to the table with the best intentions and the most clearly designed policies, we just won't be able to address these main issues. Because I mean, addressing these issues implying formulating an entirely different society.
Yeah. No, I absolutely understand where you're going at, because ask me about, you know, walking on the sidewalk in India, and I have like a million stories to share. But so this question of, you know, congested infrastructure, this question of, you know, overpopulation and class issue, all of that is pretty valid. The thing which is very important for me is because we find ourselves in a society which I mentioned. If you look at this slide, perhaps on the top, it says the best in the Human Development Index. You know, the society which is quote unquote the egalitarian model of social democracy in the world, and the society which spends 4.3% on disability protection, the highest in the world. So what I'm trying to get at is that in the low developing middle income countries, yes, that is a very, very crucial issue. But when it comes to, for instance, Blenheim or Oslo, we should make a lot more conscientious effort to kind of have our trams which don't have steps. And we can do that. Yes, it requires money, but money has not been the problem.
No.
4.3% of the GDP is not a problem. It's how you have been channelizing those resources. Like, if you know what I'm talking about. So this is very, very crucial that we kind of bring that distinction between which context we are talking about. I'm talking about less ableism, more inclusion, better universal design, more integration of persons with disabilities in the Norwegian context right now, which is doable. But perhaps in Athens, difficult, go to Mumbai, Bombay, much more difficult.
Absolutely.
So it's, and of course intersection, very, very important point, because disability is not a homogeneous category. It's an extremely heterogeneous group, as I explained, different ages, races, gender, class, also types of disability, and not all persons with disabilities are having similar access to resources and opportunities in life. For instance, persons with intellectual disabilities find themselves to be a lot more marginalized and excluded and been thrown into the psychiatric institutions than others, for instance. So there are also these elements wherein people have talked about the hierarchy of impairment groups, which is there. But howsoever you slice it and dice it, one thing which is quite clear is when you look at the broader picture in society, when you take a bird's eye view, persons with disabilities, doesn't matter their disability, race, gender, all of the rest, are excluded, marginalized, and are pushed on the sideline of the conversations. And so we have to be a little bit cognizant of that and start with that first, and then of course girls and women with disabilities are more marginalized than men with disabilities. So all of those aspects are there.
Yes, thank you very much. This is indeed a very important topic, socially and politically, and of course intellectually it opens up so many ways, paths, what can think from philosophy.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yes, I'm saying that intellectually as well, it opens up a great length of paths one can think of, from philosophy to sociology to critical anthropology and so on. So because I'm an anthropologist, I'm inclined to spontaneously think about the people themselves that are involved with the topic discussed, in our case, the disabled people. In the video, I think it was mentioned that ableism is the idea that able-bodied people are somehow fulfilling the Aristotelian potentiality of what humans should be. They fulfill the purpose of Homo sapiens. You have to move to run because you can. You should. So there are people that didn't born with a disability. They get disabled in the process.
Yes.
Right. So there is, I guess, a shocking transition status in their society and how they perceive themselves. So for them, and we know about this kind of social transition, not only in disability, because as anthropologists we study, for example, people that fell from middle class to working class during crisis, or people migrating from their community where they had a certain identity to some new place that where they were nobody. So for those people, are there any qualitative research that involve how they manage this transition, and if for them indeed this signifies a kind of fall to a lesser life?
Oh yeah.
How does that, if it can be overcome?
Yes, absolutely. By the way, if I may just compliment you, like when you were talking, I almost thought that I'm listening to Slava Zizic. I don't know, it was just perhaps. I almost thought that it's in the room. Yeah, it was very good. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right when it comes to this question of this is the discourses.
Is the
Invisible disabilities, visible, visible.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So let's ponder on this a little bit. The last point which I'm trying to explain. It's the frame which we use as a society or as individuals first, because society by itself does not have a frame which just comes up. It's the collection of individuals. Like we sitting here, we have a certain frame of who a person with disability is, how he or she behaves, what's their quality of life, how do they function, what's the human flourishing they have. So if you have all those ideas, we make a frame, and then that frame kind of goes on from one individual to a family, to a community, to a society. So what happens is that, for instance, if the frame is the philanthropic frame, then the human tragedy idea is there. And then what happens is that if that idea or the idea of biomedical, that we have to fix the disability, or the idea of, for instance, sociological norms, which you cannot do, so you are disabled, if these are the predominant frames or ideas which we are using as individuals, and then as communities, and then in popular culture and society, if we come up with those frames, then we are having a huge discussion that if a person acquires impairment, as I gave the example of that professor, everything going great in life, goes to a ski slope, falls down, has a spinal cord injury, and now is on wheelchair. So now the professor has to start thinking that at some point he or she is going to pass away also. Okay? This is not an infinite, long, able-bodied, amazing ride. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that there is that aspect as well which has to come in. Then there is this aspect of being fragile, being vulnerable, accepting the embodied experience that able-bodiedness is just part and parcel of life. And let's not go to the tragic accident thing, but also perhaps that there is just aging which is happening. You stop hearing as good as you did, or you stop seeing as good as you did. So either you can deny it and say, I don't accept it, and keep on driving, and then end up into an accident, and then go with some more injuries and impairments, or you can accept it and say, oh yeah, this is how life is. This is the long view of life. I've had my amazing time, and this is perhaps a bit rough time, but is this rough time part and parcel of life? And I when talk about Aristotle and his understanding of realizing full potentiality, it should be seen in a much more, how should I say, like both both aspects of vulnerability and courage and strength. For instance, both those things have to be part and parcel of life, and people have to, we have to tell better stories in popular culture, through academia. We need to have much better representation of persons with disabilities at academia, which is the hub for all ideas, largely a hub for ideas, and businesses, private sector, public sector. The more we see that disability is part of human life and human condition, the less we will be fixed on, focused on the idea of fixing it or human tragedy view. You can have a fully human flourishing life as best as you can with disability as well. Yeah. So it's really important to kind of have that long view.
Camelia?
Thank you for a really excellent talk. It's really illuminating. And I wanted to ask you a question about invisible disabilities and institutional policies, just as a practical question.
Yes.
Because as you mentioned, our students now might have more mental health problems and depressions and chronic fatigue also with long COVID. So how do we accommodate these needs in practice? How do we make sure that they feel that they belong at the table and belong at university? And that kind of ties into the second part of the question, which is intersectional, right?
Yes.
To what extent do you see that the students dropping out of university isn't just because of disabilities, but because of maybe race or ethnicity or a different background, and that they don't feel that they belong with a particular type of curriculum or culture and so on? So just your thoughts and suggestions.
Yes, I think this is the invisible.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember that in my head. Yeah, okay. No, that's both questions are extremely important, and that's what, for instance, perhaps you all, when you get a chance in the smaller groups, if we get the chance to reflect on it, because that is what, like, for instance, think about, like, as I gave you that example of the, if you check out the book Calling of the American Mind, in that Jonathan Haidt and George Buchanan, they talk about this idea of anti-fragility or fragility, and they try to explain that how, for instance, human beings are not as fragile as a glass, but they are not as completely anti-fragile like a glass which falls down, and not as anti-fragile as plastic cup. It's somewhere in between. As human beings, we are somewhere there. So a lot of young people with whom they have studied, they have issues when it comes to mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, social anxiety, and chronic fatigue syndrome, and so on. And now the big question is this: they should. I mentioned this in the last last slide about this question of belonging. Let's see if I could go there. Where am I?
There.
Yeah, it's here. Good. So if you look at the belonging thing, what does belonging say? That your voice is being heard. That is very important, I feel. If a student who cannot take the exam because of some condition which they explain, mental health condition or so on, or they have got a bad break in their life, they've got a bad break. If they come to the administrator, and the administrator is just shuffling the paper and saying, okay, fine, don't take it, it's fine. You know? Then, or they say, no, you have to take it because if you don't take it, then we'll kick you out. Then, they are not being heard. Yes, they have got the access. Yes, there might be diversity talk in the classroom and so on. They might have built their own set of community students, but they're not getting heard. So perhaps sometimes it's important with some small steps to just have the sensitivity that these things are real things. These are real challenges. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, and all the other things are real issues, real challenges that students face. And instead of just shrugging off and saying, come on, chin up and just move, march along, soldier, instead of going that route, perhaps hearing them, finding a place, if there is a possibility to have that they could have some counseling. I don't know if there are possibilities like that available at the university, psychologist counseling or disability counselor or a counselor who can offer. There's a special needs education department at Lebanon. For instance, I'm giving you an example. So how could things work interdisciplinarily at the university when you could pool in resources and make avenues for them to kind of express themselves, and then if they say that they cannot take the exam, and they instead of saying that they will be kicked out, what are the other options available? For instance, I don't know what options are available. You people who are working in administration know a lot better these things. So you have to kind of figure those things out, make spaces in the current policy framework and institutional framework to bring the desired change. But you have to think on those lines, interdisciplinary, trying to make some spaces, listening to the person who comes, and so on. So that's very important, and also the intersectional aspect, of course, goes without saying that you have to. It's very hard to slip into someone else's shoes, but at least the effort should be made that you are listening and you are engaging. Actively listening and engaging as an administrator or as a professor, because the job of the university system is to ensure that those who enroll end up finishing it. Well, there's no point of the enrolling and then dropping out. So, yeah, my 2 cents on that.
Okay.
I actually just wanted to bring in, there's a really vast literature in anthropology of disability that deals with a lot of things that we've talked, and this has been a really fantastic talk, and thanks for opening the space for this conversation. And I think that it actually goes back to Theo's point of changing society. Much of the ethnography that's been done with and by people with different abilities is actually calling for us to organize society in a different way.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of that can already be done. It can already be done at the level of the classroom, it can be done at the level of the department, it can be done at the level of discipline.
Correct.
Where we're thinking from a different perspective. So there's a huge critique of capitalism inside of that literature. And I think that a lot of those points are also necessary to be taken into account, that we're not, making changes so that we can include and make people be on the table, but it's actually changing the way in which we think about society itself, how we're in it, and how we interact. So in many ways, in terms of not producing capitalist workers that are just reproducing the system. And so the data that you give on labor and not being able to find jobs makes a lot of sense, because if we thought the world from what Kirk theory is, it's often called in STS literature, we would actually not be able to have capitalism. So it's very much about destroying the system of profit making that just works in one way. If we think through a lot of this literature, we're actually doing a huge critique of what capitalism is and does. So I think there's a lot that we can learn in ways that we can organize differently and do things in a different way in our own midst and in our own societies. So yeah, I think we can definitely take the critique further.
Oh, absolutely. If I may, guys, if people are interested in this this topic of how disability critique is so powerful towards capitalism or industrial society, because often capitalist processes and industrializing processes creates disability. Then the work of Vic Finkelstein from the 80s and 70s and 80s, and Mike Oliver and Colin Barnes from that period of disability history is very, very powerful, and it's so compelling, because it's trying to explain that how this whole imperative of economic productivity, and the moment you're not that productive enough, then suddenly you are in this category of UFR or disabled, and so that's very, very powerful. So yes, absolutely, and that's why I mentioned that it's so important to kind of tell a different story when it comes to disability, persons with disabilities, have that have a it from the cultural level and then have the downstream effects on politics and economy and so on. So hopefully when we are creating this universally designed inclusive societies wherein all individuals can participate irrespective of their ability status, we are moving in that direction, but it will take some time to reach that, and for that to happen, we need to be a little bit more focused on human flourishing in general as a concept, and not as disability which has to be fixed. Yeah.
Lisa?
Yeah, thank you for a brilliant talk. I'm following up on Marka and the classroom.
Yeah.
So what I've seen, and this is in a Norwegian context, in a classroom, is there a hierarchy among the disabled? For example, if you have a kid on a wheelchair, then you have a kid with impaired hearing,
Yes.
and then you have a kid who's neurovariant. And what I've seen is that this kid with neurovariant is treated more like a disruptor.
Yes, absolutely.
You don't know what to do with them.
Yeah,
And this is also a disability.
yeah, absolutely.
Do you have some? What do you think about that? I mean, is there a hierarchy among the?
Yeah, I actually alluded to that there's a hierarchy of impairment which people have talked about. It's a very, how should I say, a widely contested topic because, like any identity analysis, what happens is that if you create that hierarchy, then somebody's on the top and somebody's on the bottom. And it's, for instance, as you're rightly saying, that for instance, when we think of disability, quite often we think of a wheelchair symbol because that has been going on for such a long time. So there is a conditioning that persons with disabilities are associated with those on wheelchairs. So then the moment that has been there for such a long time, then the next thing you know is, oh yes, this person needs more resources, more attention, and so on. So and has a much greater legitimacy claim because the disability is visible. The moment the disability becomes invisible, the claims become a little bit dicey and dodgy. For instance, if a student approaches you as a professor and say, I cannot take this exam because I have been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And the next thing you see is that same student is having coffee and laughing with her friends outside. Then you might say, is she telling the real truth and why, and so on. So, but if that same student is on a wheelchair and says that, I cannot take this exam because I'm going for some spinal cord treatment or some treatment at SUNAS, a rehabilitation treatment at SUNAS. Then okay, fine, understand. So there are these legitimacy claims which also have to be negotiated and understood. And with visible disabilities, it's a lot more easy to prove. And with invisible, it requires a lot more understanding and trust. That's one aspect of it. And when you said about this neurodivergent group, that is very, very important because the purpose of the classroom is to make it as inclusive as possible. There's this ideal of wherein all children, irrespective of their abilities, can participate. Education for all, inclusive education. I worked on projects like that in the African country context. And what happens is that it is much easier to talk about that than to kind of implement it in a real classroom setting, because what you said is if there's a child who has like some tics and who cannot sit stable in the class, then it's very easy for the teacher to say, oh, this child is a disruptor. As compared to, for instance, as you mentioned, if there's a child who's using a wheelchair or a deaf child, he or she, wheelchair child might perhaps have a personal assistant, a deaf child might have perhaps a sign language interpreter, and the problem is kind of circumnavigated. But the problem does not easily circumnavigate or get circumscribed for the child who is neurodivergent, who has tics or has ADHD and other conditions. So then that is where the challenge is, that how do we kind of then create a system wherein perhaps the teacher is having two other assistants in the class, and one of the assistants is going to be focused on this child who is neurodivergent, and perhaps take the child out after every 15 minutes for a walk or something and then bring him back in. So inclusion is messy, it's not straightforward, it's not an easy task, it requires a lot of commitment, a lot of sacrifices, but it's an ideal worth pursuing. Because if you don't pursue that ideal, The next thing is that we don't need that child who's neurodivergent in the class, and also, you know, we don't have the resources for the sign language interpreter, so we don't need the deaf child as well. And also, perhaps the personal assistant for the wheelchair child is a bit of a nuisance. We don't need that. So essentially, we go back to the point of segregation and exclusion and marginalization. So that's why it's very, very important to kind of, if I may say, hold the fort, even if it's harder to do it. Yeah.
Thomas?
Yes, so thanks so much. If I could just return and follow up a bit on what some of the others were saying to the epistemology of anthropology and the question of framing that I raised very briefly earlier on, because I think it's crucial. Anthropology is the study of human diversity, but what kinds of diversity do we study and how do we frame diversity? Yes, it is true that we do have now quite a bit of research on disability, but rarely sort of within the framework of the study of diversity. So when Hilde Hauerland, whom Torgeir mentioned, who's now a professor of deaf studies, when she was doing her MPhil, we were discussing possible theoretical approaches to her work. And in the end, we agreed that she would probably profit more from looking at anthropological research on ethnicity and ethnic hierarchies and feminism than the mainly sociological problem-oriented tradition of disability studies. And she did, and I think, you know, the result was quite good, and she's followed up on that. So the way we frame the world is incredibly important, and the way we can use this not only to try to improve the world, but also to understand it a bit better. And of course, I mean, I agree with what Macca says about and what Theo also suggested, that neoliberal capitalism places a lot of demands on us. A colleague of ours, a social anthropologist, I studied with him, and for many years he was working with an attempt to integrate deaf people fully into the labour market. And he says that it's become increasingly difficult. It's become incredibly difficult because you now have to be so perfectly adapted in every way. You have to function perfectly in every way, which wasn't the case maybe 20 or 30 years ago in the same way. There was more slack. We were less tolerant, but more tolerant in a way. More inclusive. We could use the N-word, but we were able to get deaf people into the labour market. So there is something paradoxical about the way the neoliberal world is going. The best example I can come up with, I'll end now, okay? Is a short story, a rare foray into cultural relativism by the science fiction author H.G. Wells at the beginning of the 20th century. You would know it. It's called In the Country of the Blind. Well, you have this, this remote secret valley somewhere in the Andes where everybody's blind, probably for genetic reasons. And then the pilot, comes out. I mean, he sort of stumbles down and he's seeing, and he's thinking, wow, I can be king here. Drawing on the proverb in the land of the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. But it turns out it doesn't work at all because their entire society, their entire culture is built up around blindness. So he fails in every effort, and in the end, they give him surgery out of mercy. Because there is something about his eyes that disturbs him, and that makes him confused. And he becomes happy in the end, integrated into the society.
So that's an excellent example, and actually a follow-up of that is if you have Apple TV, there is this series called C, which is actually based on a similar premise that we find ourselves in 2049, and apocalypse has happened, and everybody on the planet Earth is blind. And then there are only a few individuals who are, because of some genetic defect, are sighted. So how do they navigate? So it's precisely hitting on those points that it depends upon how you structure the society, what kind of stories you have told, and then in that society, the sighted were the ones who were kind of feeling excluded, marginalized, and they were not able to fight as good as these other people or move as easily in dark and other spaces.
And I also liked your emphasis on diversity. In 2007, we had the official year of diversity in this country, copying the Swedes, of course. They had their year of diversity in 2006. And I was asked to give some advice to the Minister of Culture, who was responsible for the year of diversity. And I said that when you say diversity, you immediately think about visible minorities. You think about immigrants, don't you? Muslims, Sami, non-white people. And he had them, I suppose what you said. And then I said, what about one-legged single men who play the accordion and live in the Western Fjord? Are they not part of this diversity? Are they less excluded from mainstream society? shouldn't we pay attention to other forms of diversity as well? They never did in the end. But I think you got the point. but that's one way of framing it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Thinking about disability as part of this world of diversity, as you did.
And it's part of a human condition, whether we like it or not. It's part of a human condition, disability. So, we should understand it like that, and make sure that when these diversity conferences or events happen, that we kind of smuggle in this as a concept and actually make those people reflect upon, because it's quite easy and congenial and intellectually lazy socially and politically prudent to just talk about diversity in this very narrow sense of gender and race and ethnic minority, which is obvious and understandable, and anything which is a little bit more problematic, as you give the example of a Caucasian man in the field, one-legged person, that person should be included in the diversity conversation. Absolutely.